Welcome to the Believer's Voice of Victory broadcast. I'm Jeremy Pearsons, and I'm coming to you again today from Brother Andrew Womack's studio here in beautiful Woodland Park, Colorado. And I want to say thank you to Brother Andrew and his team for truly being partners with this ministry and helping us get this word out. Praise God. Now, our featured guest on the broadcast today is David Barton, and he shared a message at Eagle Mountain International Church, and when he did, we realized we needed to get it out to you before the upcoming elections. And I encourage you to download the study notes for this week's broadcast. They contain all the scriptures and the teaching points from David's messages. Just go to kcm.org/notes. Now, let's join David Barton as he begins today with America and the Constitution.
Thanks, guys. You guys take a seat. I want to start out by just kind of looking at America for a moment from the standpoint of government. We have a government like all nations have a government of some type. This year, there's 195 nations at the UN. So we have 195 nations. Guys, if we can get that up, thank you. There's 195 different nations at the UN. They all have a government of some type. Now, what's interesting is our Constitution we did in 1787. We ratified it in 1788, and we've been operating under the Constitution since 1789. So America's only ever had one Constitution. If you look across the rest of the world, it's very interesting to see how many constitutions they've had in that same period of time or less. Imagine living in nations where you have this many constitutions in the same or less period of time than America has. In America, we often take for granted the stability we have. It's a real blessing, but we don't recognize that because that's all we've ever known. We haven't known other things. Last year, we had a congressional delegation in Poland, and I was talking to people in Poland, alive people talking to me who have lived through 7 constitutions in their lifetime. So if you look, South Korea, that's a stable nation. We think of it as a stable nation. It's an ally. 6 constitutions since 1948. We don't think in those terms. And so literally, if you were to ask the question, what's the average length of a constitution in the history of the world? The answer is 17 years. So 17 years is what a nation averages. That's an average nation is 17 years in the Constitution. We're at 233 this year. That's not average. That's very different. We are the exception. We're not the rule. No other nation has been the same length of time under a Constitution as America has. If you look at what America enjoys in the way of creativity, America has 4% of the world's population, and 4% of the world's population should produce 4% of whatever. But that's not the case in America. Our 4% of the world's population, we produce more innovation, more technology, more medical cures, more discoveries, more symphonies, more plays, more books, more everything than the other 96% of the world combined. So our 4% produces more than the rest of the world. We take for granted all the technology we enjoy. I was in Germany a couple of years ago, do a lot of speaking at U.S. military bases, and so I was in Germany there, and I got to stay at a 5-star hotel in Germany, and that's pretty cool because that is an ancient nation. It goes back centuries and centuries and centuries, and so there I am at this 5-star hotel in Germany, and for a cowboy kind of guy from Texas, that's a big deal. And it would have been really nice if they would have had internet at their hotel. We've got internet at Motel 6 here. I mean, everybody's got internet. There's so much we take for granted that the rest of the world doesn't enjoy. The same when you look at prosperity. Our 4% of the world's population produces 25% of the world's gross domestic product. And it's not that we have more, we have much fewer natural resources than other nations. For example, agriculture, the kind of lifestyle that I have on the ranch. Agriculture, America is number 66 in the world in percentage of farmable land, but America is number 2 in the world in farm production. So we're way down with natural resources. We're way up. America takes what we have and makes it go further than any other nation. So this is what's become historically known as American exceptionalism. Now, that phrase drives professors through the roof today. America is not exceptional. Yes, we are. There's all sorts of statistics. It's not a matter of arrogance or pride or anything else. That's just the fact. America is the exception, not the rule. We have stability when other nations don't. We have prosperity when other nations don't. We have creativity when other nations. We're the exception, not the rule. So the question becomes, so how did you get there? Who's responsible for all this that America enjoys and that America often takes for granted? And if you look at leaders, invariably textbooks will point to political leaders. They'll point to people like George Washington. They'll point to founders like John Hancock or John Adams. And those are all fine. I mean, they had a huge role in helping America have the form of government that's been so special. But what's interesting is if you go back to when John Adams was an old man, the millennial, if you will, of his generation, the younger generation his time, a guy named Hezekiah Niles came to him and said, hey, I'm doing a history book. This was 1816. And so I've got this history book from 1818. If you were here yesterday, you know that we own about 120,000 documents from before 1812. So thousands of documents of the guys we call founding fathers. Well, I've got that textbook that Hezekiah Niles did, 1818. So 1816, he writes John Adams and said, look, we were young, we weren't part of it back there, we're really enjoying what we have in the nation now, but I'm writing this history book and I need to know from you as a participant, as an eyewitness, as a guy who was in it, who were the most important people back then? Who do you look to as the most important people? And so when John Adams was asked that, he had a number of names, and among the names he included were people like the Reverend Samuel Cooper. He said the Reverend Jonathan Mayhew. He called out the Reverend George Whitfield and the Reverend Charles Chauncey. He went through and listed preachers. Now, those aren't the guys we find in history books today, but that's who he thought was really significant back then. And we don't list preachers today, whether they're white or whether they're black. We usually don't even know who they are. So if you add Richard Allen and you add people like Absalom Jones or John Marrant or Lemuel Haynes or Harry Hoosier, I don't think I know those names. Let me just take a story from Harry Hoosier for a minute. Harry Hoosier, really interesting guy. Harry Hoosier had been a slave. He became a Christian. He was freed. He ends up working with Francis Asbury. Now, if you know anything about Francis Asbury, he's part of the Great Awakenings, part of the revivals we had in America. Francis Asbury spent most of his ministry on horseback. The guy rode 300,000 miles on horseback sharing the gospel all over the country. Had a huge impact, had huge crowds. People came out in mass numbers to hear him. Well, Francis also had Harry preach at those revival meetings. And Harry actually got larger crowds than Asbury did. So Asbury gets these massive, we know the name Asbury today, we don't know Harry Hoosier. Benjamin Rush, who's the signer of the Declaration of Independence, said, I heard Harry preach. He said, he's the greatest orator I've ever heard. Well, he's heard all the other guys. He's heard the Patrick Henrys and the Jeffersons, and he said, no, the best orator I've ever heard is Harry Hoosier. Well, Harry, as he works, all these people get converted under his ministry, and so their ministry, by and large, it was kind of a blue-collar ministry because they're riding everywhere, they're on horseback, they're out in the woods, and they're out in the farm countries, and they're out in the rural areas. And all these blue-collar guys are kind of getting converted, and you got mountain men in there, and you got frontiersmen, and you got explorer and woodsmen. And a lot of the revivals they conducted were out kind of in the rural areas of eastern Pennsylvania and elsewhere. And so as these guys get converted, they are explorers, they are woodsmen, they are frontiers guys, and so they start moving toward the west because they want the rough country. And as they get into the west, they get into this country here, and people in that country looked at them and said, these guys behave a little different than everybody else. That's because they're Hoosiers. Now, why would they be called Hoosiers? Because they were converts of Harry Hoosier. I wonder how many people in Indiana today know that they were named after a black evangelist. Probably very few. Now, it would seem like that might be something we should cover in history, but like Columbus yesterday, if you were here, we don't cover this stuff anymore. We don't know where the name Hoosier came from. Well, we actually do know where the name Hoosier came from. We just don't tell that anymore. And there's so many more stories like that. If I take you to this guy named John Marrant, when John Marrant was 13 years old, he was in Charleston, South Carolina. And as he was in South Carolina, he was a child prodigy in music. He was great on the French horn, the violin. He was probably the most sought-after guy in town to play to play concerts, but to play for private parties and everything else. So he was raking in lots of money. And he said he was on his way, he and a friend were on a way to play for a party one time, private party, and they went by a meeting house, which was his church. And he says he went by the meeting house, he said he heard a crazy man inside hallooing at the crowd. Well, the crazy man actually happened to be George Whitfield, who was preaching in the Great Awakening. And so as John went by, he and his friend talked about it, and he said, hey, let's go in and let's see what's going on. The friend said, there's no way I'm going to that meeting. He said, yeah, come on, let's go see. And the friend said, I'll only go in there if you promise to take out your horn and break up the meeting. And John said, I'm down with that. Let's do it. So they go inside. John pulls his horn out. He starts to blow the horn to break up the meeting. And he said that as he started to blow the horn, Whitfield spun and turned and pointed at him and said, prepare to meet thy God. And when he said that, Marrant said he fell down speechless and senseless, just hit the deck, was out, couldn't move at all. And so people were concerned about him. They came, tried to get him up. They couldn't revive him. They couldn't get him up. He was laying there on the floor, speechless and senseless. They called for medical people to come try to see what the problem was. Well, the meeting continues to go on, and at the end, about a half hour later, Whitfield's finished, and he comes back and he looks at John laying there on the ground, just paralyzed, just can't move. And he looks at him and says, "So, the Lord Jesus has got thee at last." He said, "I've got a friend." He said, I would love to spend time with you, but I'm leaving town. I have more meetings, but I will send a friend to talk to you about what's happened to you. And so they got John up. They carried him home. They got him in bed at home. They called for more doctors to see what was wrong, why he couldn't move, and why he was semi-paralyzed. And so a couple days later, a preacher shows up at the front door and says, "George Whitfield asked me to come meet with you." And so he went in beside John on the bed. John was laying on the bed, and the preacher said, "Can I pray for you?" And John said, "No, no." And he said, he took my hand and prayed for me. And he said, as he took my hand, I was so fearful that I actually rolled off the bed on the other side. So he hits the floor on the back side of the bed. The preacher picks him up, puts him back on the bed, grabs his hand, prays for him, said, "How do you feel?" And John said, "I feel terrible. This is worse." He said, "Well, let me pray again." "No." So he prayed again. "How do you feel?" "I feel really bad." So he prayed a third time. "How do you feel?" And John said, "I feel really different. Something's going on." And so he actually ends up having a dramatic conversion to Christ. And he had such a dramatic conversion, got such a love for Jesus and the Word of God and the Bible, that his family thought he went way too far off the edge. And so the family, as John said, they did everything to me except that which was good. So they really persecuted him. So here he is, 13 years old, and they want him out of the home. They don't want anything to do with what he's got. So he heads out in the woods. He just leaves the house. He's basically been thrown out. And as he gets in the woods, he meets up with a Cherokee Brave. And this Cherokee Brave that's in the woods, for the next 10 weeks, they just kind of hang around together. And so they hunt together and they do all sorts of stuff together, and good relationship, good friendship. At the end of 10 weeks, the Brave says, "I have to go back to my tribe." John said, "Well, I don't have anywhere to go. I've been living here in the woods with you." And so the Brave says, "Well, come on with me." And John says, "Well, the Cherokees have a law that any outsider of their tribe will be killed." And then the Brave said, "I'll speak for you. It'll be all right." So as they went to the tribe, they got there, and the chief, when they saw John Marrant, the chief said, "Kill him." And so they started coming to kill John, and the Brave tried to speak, and they hauled the Brave off to the side. They held John. They had a trial. They had what was called the judge and the executioner, and John called him the king. He was the chief of the tribe. And so they sentenced him to death because he should not have been in the village. So they put him in a hut. And John had his Bible with him, because when he left home, he had the Bible with him. So they put him in a hut, and as he's been sentenced to death, and the executioner has shown him how he's going to die, and it was barbaric. John records all of this. So as he's in that hut, he's praying that night, and he at first is scared of dying. He says, "But wait a minute. If I die, I get to be with Jesus. This is really good." So he starts praying all night, and he's praying to Jesus, and the executioner has a guard on the hut to make sure he doesn't get away, and the guard tells the executioner, he's in there talking to somebody. I don't know who's in there. I don't know how they got in, but he's in there talking to somebody. So the executioner throws the door open and goes in. "Who are you talking to?" "I'm talking to Jesus." "I don't see anybody." "Well, he's here." And so it ends up, the executioner gets converted. The judge gets converted. They take him to the king because they don't want him to be killed now. And the king is really angry at him. And actually, when he starts talking to the king's daughter, 16-year-old, here's what John says, and she gets converted, and she goes over and grabs his Bible and hugs it and puts it up to her ear and kisses the Bible. And the king is so angry, he says, "You got my daughter under a spell. You free her from that spell right now, or I'll chop you to pieces in front of me." Well, it ends up the king gets converted. So the whole tribe gets converted. So this Cherokee chief says to John, he says, "We've got a lot of allied tribes around here. Why don't you go speak to all these other tribes, because they need to hear what you've told us." And so, but he says, the deal is, if you go in, they're going to do to you what we try to do to you, and that is kill you. So I'm going to take my personal bodyguards, 50 of them. I'm going to send them with you, and I want you to go from tribe to tribe to tribe, and those bodyguards will make sure nothing happens to you. So John ends up becoming Cherokee for all practical purposes. He dressed the same way, painted his face the same way, did everything the same, looked exactly like a Cherokee. And for the next 2 years, he went from tribe to tribe, converted them to Christianity. Went from not only from the Cherokee, but to the Catawba, to the Hausar, to the Creek. 13 and 14 years old, he's the first black American to successfully evangelize Native Americans in America. Terrific, terrific story. John actually recorded that story. He wrote a narrative here. You can see the narrative, 1785. Here's a copy, early copy of that narrative. This is one of the 2 best-selling black narratives in American history, was a story of John Marrant, and we've never ever heard of the story today. It's just kind of gone and not there anymore. You have the same difficulty when you come to Lemuel Haynes. Lemuel Haynes, a very famous name, or should be. He was a famous preacher across New England and states like Vermont and New York and Massachusetts, elsewhere. And this is actually an original painting of him back in the founding era. Now, would you please look at that painting and tell me something about his congregation? They're all white. They can't do that. They were all racist back then. Again, bad history. There's just so much more to the story than what we hear. And so you see him here with this congregation. An interesting thing about him, he is the first black man in American history to receive a degree of higher education. And you would think in history books we would want to do first. We would want to talk about first. And so the first black man to break through and receive a degree in higher education. He's also the first black man to have a sermon published. This is a published sermon of Lemuel Haynes from back in the day. So he's the first black man to have a published sermon. And in addition to that, it's interesting, Lemuel Haynes was also a soldier in the American Revolution. He was one of the Minutemen, one of the famous Minutemen. And so he served under George Washington. And in his churches, on George Washington's birthday, he would give a sermon on his commander-in-chief, George Washington, with whom, and we're told how racist Washington is and all the statues of Washington have to come down. And again, we have such an incomplete story today. Here you have black heroes from previous generations who knew Washington, who were with him, who praised Washington, who actually preached sermons about Washington. And actually, this book right here, this is the Bible of Lemuel Haynes. And inside his Bible, you see his name sketched inside the Bible. I'll try to be careful opening this and show you. But this is the Bible of Lemuel Haynes, and there is his name on the inside of that cover. So he's a real guy, and he's a really cool guy. We just don't know anything about him today. So many others. Let me go through some chronological stuff for a minute. I want to take you to the American Revolution. Let's go to 1775 of April. April 1775 is when we have Paul Revere making his famous ride. Now, as Paul Revere rides, it turns out that throughout the Revolution there were a number of times that people made Paul Revere kind of rides. And so Paul Revere was not the only one who rode to alert the patriots. Others did so as well. And one of those guys who rode to alert the patriots was a guy named Wentworth Cheswell. He's a black patriot. Now, Wentworth Cheswell up in New Hampshire. Interesting thing about Wentworth Cheswell is the first black man elected to office in America. Well, I can't say that. We had blacks elected to office in 1641 and 1642 in colonies like Maryland, etc. But in 1768, in the colonial era, he's elected to office. Now, these are a number of documents from Wentworth Cheswell. And by the way, I love the fact that in the American Revolution, it was blacks and whites doing so much together. And it's a narrative you won't hear today. But again, we've got so much of the history, so much of the documents, so much of the old textbooks. But he's the first guy elected to office in America. These are some of the documents from Wentworth Cheswell when he was a judge. He served not only, and by the way, he was reelected for 49 years. This is one of the documents when he was a judge. He was reelected for 49 years. And across those 49 years, he held 8 different political positions. Now, his town was very white, and he is clearly black. And they elected him to office, just like they did in so many other places, just like you had Lemuel Haynes, the black pastor of a white congregation. There was racism in America, but systemic and institutional? No, it existed in locations and locales, it existed in places in the South. But as you get into New England area and as you get into northern United States, very, very, very different story. Now, interestingly enough, Wentworth Cheswell is not only a patriot, but he's a historian. He is responsible for these books right here. This is the first history done of New Hampshire. So he is a scholar, he is a patriot, he is a political leader, he's all sorts of stuff. You would think the textbooks would want to talk about the first black guy elected to office in colonial America. Gone. Nothing there, nothing said about it. So as you move past that, we go back to Paul Revere. He's making his ride. When Paul Revere makes his ride, he is looking for two individuals. He's got to find Hancock and he's got to find John Adams, because the British have ordered them to be executed on the spot. All the other patriots can be forgiven, but these two guys have to be executed. So as Revere rides, he's riding to the home of the Reverend Jonas Clark, because that's where the political leaders stayed, was with the church leaders. And so they're here in the town of Lexington, and they're here with Jonas Clark. And when word gets there, and Hancock and Adams turned to Pastor Clark and said, "Pastor, are you people ready for this?" He said, "Of course they are." He said, "I'm training for this very hour." So the next morning actually, is when we have the first battle of the American Revolution. It's the Battle of Lexington. And it occurred when 70 men from his church went out to take on 800 British citizens. And so often in the American Revolution, it was churches that went out to defend their town. So the Reverend Jonas Clark, his church goes out, and at the end of the battle, there were 18 Americans lying on the ground, dead and wounded. Those 18 Americans included white patriots like John Robinson, black patriots like Prince Estabrook. White and black laying on the ground together, because they all went to church together. They were all out of his church. They were all fellow parishioners. Now, that again is not the story we hear. And by the way, Prince Estabrook, even back in the day, they did monuments to Prince Estabrook way back then. They're still doing monuments to Prince Estabrook today. It's just that unless you're there to see them, we don't study this in history anymore. Now, we used to know who Prince Estabrook is. Don't know the guy anymore. If you go to June of 1775, this is the Battle of Bunker Hill. This is now 3 battles later. This is the 4th battle of the Revolution. And so the Battle of Bunker Hill, this is printed by a guy named John Trumbull, who's called the painter of the American Revolution. All of that, and then you got over there. He put 2 guys off on the side, to make sure you would see them, to make sure you'd see this guy right here, Peter Salem. Peter Salem is the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And so put him off there away from the crowd so you could tell who's there. And he's standing right there beside Thomas Grosvenor again, black and white, side by side. You had this cooperation going on for so long. So Peter Salem is the guy that literally saved countless American lives that day. After the battle, they presented him to Commander-in-Chief. He had dozens of military commendations from officers on all the courage, heroism he did. We don't hear that name, but we used to. As a matter of fact, here's a textbook from the 1840s. And in the textbook in the 1840s, who are we showing as the Battle of Bunker Hill? The clear hero there, the clear patriot is Peter Salem. Then you go to the 1870s. Now we're into color pictures in the textbooks, but we're still showing the clear hero as Peter Salem. By the way, in that same battle was also another hero named Salem Poor. He also was a black patriot. He also received numerous commendations that day. So the heroes of the Battle of Bunker Hill were black patriots. We don't know that today. We used to know that back then. So again, and by the way, what do you think would happen with race relations in general if we knew more of our own history? If we knew more of what happened, we would have a different view of all sorts of things. This is where not knowing history has a huge impact on public policy. If you don't know history and what's happened, then you can be talked into all sorts of things that are counterproductive and are completely antithetical to what the nation really stood for. Now, and that's not saying we didn't have racism. We definitely had racism. We're going to talk more about that later. But you just need to know there's another part of the story.
We hope you enjoyed today's teaching from Kenneth Copeland Ministries. And remember, Jesus is Lord.